First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for the invitation. I always find it nice to come back to Budapest. Before I begin my presentation, I just want to actually make a couple of comments made in the very last panel. I had to keep my mouth quiet to let everybody else give their presentations and ask questions. But a couple of points I wanted to raise before I get into the heart of my talk. And the first one is about Euroscepticism, and that is, I think we should not forget that in a lot of Western European countries, the politicians of mainstream parties in government, in between elections, that is, in between European elections, when they usually come out to demonstrate their pro-European credentials, engage in a low-level, almost daily, soft Eurosceptic rhetoric, whether it's having to implement a directive or prevent a company being taken over because of state aid rules. They usually blame Brussels. So if you think about the constant drip, drip, drip of don't blame us, blame Brussels, when in fact those governments may have been involved in the legislation in the Council of Ministers for those pieces of legislation, it's not too surprising to me that what they have unintentionally done is to prepare the ground in terms of the legitimacy for more explicit anti-EU parties. So that's one observation. The second one is that the European Union, this is an East-West difference, the European Union has become, in general, since the mid-1990s, more intrusive, and I'm saying that in a value-neutral way, in the economic systems of all the member states. With Eastern Europe, of course, that was much more direct right in the beginning, in the 1990s, in the attempts to qualify to become candidate states, and then the negotiations throughout that time to meet different sections of the acquis communautaire. And in Western Europe, we had the launch after the Maastricht Treaty of the necessary steps to qualify for the Eurozone. We should remember the convergence criteria that many countries had to meet, which was reducing their public debt, reducing inflation, budget deficits, and these began to spark resistances in the mainstream parties. If we can detail some of the splits in mainstream parties, center-right and center-left, during this period of time, the mid to late 1990s, which is also the period of time that academic study began to notice something that was then labeled Euroscepticism. So I think the roots of a lot of what we've been talking about today actually go back a little way. And the last point I'd make is that when we talk about skepticism of the European Union, I think many times it's skepticism of a particular political economic orientation of the European Union. And my question would have been to Jolt that the economic crisis would have been reflected in many of the tables that he had, the graphs that he had from the 2012 European Social Survey. That being said, I'll now turn to my presentation, which is about European political parties, or the so-called Euro parties. So I'm speaking of transnational European political parties and European parliamentary representation. The talk will cover three areas. And those three areas, first of all, are the new procedures intended to enhance the legitimacy of the European Parliament and the European Union in general through the new way of appointing a Commission President. Now, we heard earlier today about the so-called Spitzenkandidatin. I won't be using that term again since you've already heard it, and I have to pause and think of how to make sure I pronounce that correctly. But I will be talking a little bit about the implications of the selection of the next Commission President. Second, I want to turn briefly to look at these predictions of many more anti-EU members of the European Parliament that may appear after these elections. And then finally, I'd like to conclude with some comments regarding the impact of these elections on the notion of parliamentary or European parliamentary representation. So first of all, many of you may already know this, but just to recap, the Lisbon Treaty provides that the European Council take into consideration the results of the elections to the European Parliament when they nominate or appoint a new president of the European Commission. Now that phrase, take into consideration, well, take into consideration is something that you can stretch depending on your particular perspective or your particular partisan view. Now, in anticipation of implementing this procedure, the so-called Euro parties, which are the extra-parliamentary party organizations, of which the parliamentary parties are the parliamentary groups, the party groups in the European Parliament, they set about a procedure in each of them to nominate a candidate for the post of Commission President. And as already been mentioned, we have Mr. Juncker from the European People's Party, and we have Mr. Schulz for the Party of European Socialists, Mr. Verhofstadt for the Liberals, Mr. Tsipras for the European Left Party, and finally, the Greens, being the Greens, we have co-presidents, Madame Keller and Monsieur Beauvais of France. And essentially, the idea was that the party group that wins a majority would then have their candidate as the European Parliament's candidate for the Council now to take into consideration to become president. Now, what is, I think, clear is that none of these party groups are going to win an outright majority. So what will happen is that the party group that wins a plurality will then, the day after the elections or soon thereafter, have to negotiate with the other parliamentary parties to form a majority. So, for instance, if Mr. Schulz were to come out, the PES, the Party of European Socialists, with the most, he'd have to see if he can get Greens, Liberals, and whoever else to put together a majority. If it's Mr. Juncker, the same thing. It's unlikely that it'll be Mr. Verhofstadt or the Greens. So the question then becomes, what kind of deals are going to be made to put together that majority? That individual then, who is finally able to command a majority, is to be the choice of the European Parliament presented to the European Council, that's the heads of state, to become the Commission President. Now, not all national parties are a member of a European party, one of these Euro parties. So, for instance, the British Conservatives are not a member of the EPP, so they're not involved in that decision-making. Some parties, like the British Labour Party, explicitly did not support Mr. Schulz as a candidate of the Party of European Socialists. So putting together that majority may not be so simple as one might think the day after the elections. The second thing is that the Commission had the idea that if they personalized, and also these European parties, if they personalized these elections, so you have a face that, in theory, voters could identify, and also identify their partisan position, that would engage more voters to turn out to vote. Because one of the things that the European Commission itself has been quite concerned about for over 10 years now is the legitimacy of EU legislation. And so what they are hoping to do is to reverse the declining turnout for European Parliament elections by personalizing these elections and linking then those elections, hopefully a higher turnout, to the choice of the Commission President. So it would be an enhancement of European governance, That, at least on paper, was the plan. However, will this occur? As I said, it's unlikely that there's going to be a majority for the PES or the EPP, so a coalition to gain majority support in the European Parliament will have to take place. That means, most likely, that we may end up with a grand coalition. PES and the EPP collaborating, if not for the choice of the president, then in everyday legislative politics. And I'll come back to why that's maybe an issue later. We also don't know how the European Council is going to react. We already know that some national governments do not want to cede the power of the European Council to determine who the Commission President is. And so some of them may resist having to accept the Parliament's choice for Commission President, since after all, the Council must take into consideration the results of the European elections. That's not exactly a binding rule. So we may have some ambiguity after the European elections. Now, the parties in the European Parliament, that is, who have transnational parties, have released a statement in early April saying that they remain committed that whoever they finally decide to be their choice is the official choice of the European Parliament. But as I say, there's still a lot of ambiguity, a lot of drama still to come after the European elections. And finally, on this point, if we ended up with a center-left candidate from the European Parliament, the European Council at the moment is, I think it's a slight majority, is center-right. So you'd have a center-right council seemingly obliged to appoint a center-left Commission President. And we still don't even know what that means. What would a center-left Commission President do? Act as a center-left policy orientation in terms of the work package of the Commission? Or is it simply that they have enhanced legitimacy because they owe their position to the European Parliament, but left versus right doesn't really enter the picture? Again, this is part of the ambiguity that's going to follow the elections. So there's still a lot of drama, as I said, to come. Secondly, the results of the European elections. It's been predicted there will be an increase in anti-EU members of the European Parliament from the far left and the far right. Most of the headlines have been taken up by parties from the far right, Front National in France, and etc., both in Western and in Eastern Europe. One note of caution about that is that for some of these parties, and perhaps not in Hungary where the turnout rate is predicted to be fairly high compared to some Western European countries, which after all European elections have been considered second order for quite a long time, and so the turnout rate is substantially lower than for national elections. The electorate for some of these far-right parties are the very people who normally do not turn out for elections. So just a note of caution, it probably pays to actually wait to see what the actual results are, and not get too carried away with the predictions beforehand. But what could be some of the potential effects of an increase in anti-EU members of the European Parliament? Well, whether they form a cohesive group or not, and it's probably unlikely that all anti-EU MEPs are going to sit in one group. There will probably be 2 or 3 various groups, and with some non-attached as well. They do make it hard for the European Parliament to say that these elections have conferred legitimacy when there's an increase in its own members opposed to the European Union and the work of the European Parliament itself. Second, no clear center-left or center-right means a grand coalition. And a grand coalition undermines the very efforts that some thought were necessary to bring more clarity to voters about how the European Union or the European Parliament works. That is, a government and an opposition, at least within the European Parliament. So left versus right, whether it's center left or center right. Now that brings me to mention an episode, an academic episode. 2006, there was a debate published by Notre Europe, Mr. Delors' organization in Paris, between two political scientists, Simon Hicks and Stefano Bartolini. And Simon Hicks argued that what's needed to enhance the legitimacy and raise the turnout rate is to politicize the European Union where possible. And so that, he thought, would elevate left versus right issues, which voters understand from their national parliamentary elections. And Stefano, in his rebuttal, said, amongst other things, you know, if you politicize the European Union, you're opening up a Pandora's box, and what you could do is actually mobilize anti-EU sentiment. And that was in 2006. This is 8 years later, and I think Stefano Bartolini's perspective may be winning the day a bit, although, as you say, we have a little over a week to see now what are the results of the European elections. And then finally, on this point, the results of the European elections, there could be a sort of renationalization within the European Parliament. And by that, I mean, if we do assume there will be more members of the anti-European Union parties in the European Parliament, it's still predicted that there will be a majority of, to use any other word, pro-European parties to pass legislation, even though that puts now a premium on the Socialists and the EPP to work together. But I think what this might do with the reduced majority is put a premium on the interests of the national delegations within those big parliamentary party groups, the Socialists and the European People's Party. That is, it could affect the cohesiveness of those groups. Now, one of the things that political scientists have told us over the last 20 years is that there's been a growing cohesiveness of voting amongst the party groups. I'm wondering if now that these votes count that much more because of the reduced majority, that certain national delegations may actually exercise or flex their muscles in ways they hadn't done before when it didn't matter. And then finally, I'll just turn to my last point, European parliamentary representation. At a time when the Lisbon Treaty provisions are intended to make EU governance more representative, that is, through this procedure of appointing the European Commission President on the basis of the European elections, there's a potential, on the basis of what I've said so far, for this to backfire. That the individual eventually named may actually come about from the usual backroom deals amongst heads of states. Coupled with talk of an inner and outer core of the European Union, the UK would not be in the inner core of the European Union, these results could trigger moves towards significant institutional change in the European Union. Let's recall that the fiscal compact itself is intended to be brought into the treaties by 2018. And if so, if there is moves towards significant institutional change, it again will bring up this issue of democratic accountability. Where does it fit in, let's say, a core European Union? The problem is that moves to institutionalize a core EU resurrects elite versus mass opinion on European integration itself, what we've been touching on throughout the day here. So, as I said, after these elections, the show isn't over, at least until near the end of this calendar year, before we have a new commission and a new Parliament sitting itself in Brussels.